First of all, really, really inspiring presentation by Olga. And that MBA, you know, there's a famous joke in Silicon Valley that one MBA, one engineer is plus 100,000 to your valuation, and one MBA is minus $100,000. It doesn't apply in this case. So that's a real thing taught by people who have what to share. So do sign up. I'm actually very much encouraging people to do so. We have another MBA here, by the way. Maybe we'll touch on that. So look, very privileged to have Sasha today, a native of Moldova, and the investor in one of the best funds globally. But maybe you'll tell us about yourself briefly. So who is Sasha? Who is Atomico?
Amazing. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a big privilege. I think we were chatting yesterday that this is my first time been in Moldova for a business reason, which is very encouraging and great for me because Moldova has a special place in my heart. As you mentioned, I was born in Moldova in a small village, very small village next to the Romanian border, but then for the next almost 20 years have lived outside of Moldova. So as the moderator mentioned, started in quantum physics, started in hardcore science, but then most of my professional life I've spent in the early stages. So most recently, I've been with a fund called Atomico. I've been there for 6 years. Atomico is one of the largest and oldest venture capital firms in Europe, where we have over $6 billion under management. We're now investing out of our sixth fund, which is $125 billion. So I'm one of the 4 partners that does early stage investments. We invest globally, but obviously as a fund that originated from Europe 20 years ago, our core market is Europe, and it's especially pleasing to see many great companies being started in Moldova.
Great. So look, we're trying to make it, I think the goal for this session is to make it as insightful and practical as possible, right? So my first question is, going to the theme of this startup summit is, you've been investing across Eastern Europe in your previous life, also now as Atomico. So just to set the scene, what makes Eastern European startup scene unique? What is special about this space?
Yeah, I think obviously there are many opportunities and many challenges. I think on the opportunities, probably would highlight 3. One is the talent density. Olga mentioned, how many brilliant engineers we have here in Moldova, but then if you expand it to the broader Central and Eastern European region, it's many more engineers and many more talented developers, many more, hardcore scientists and so on and so forth. And I think that definitely has a legacy in the fundamental education that we have here. Math is definitely one of the core elements that people study, and therefore that is a good base for further development. The second is resilience. Olga also highlighted that. I do think that because of historical instability, resilience has become a part of the DNA, and that is critical for startup success because everyone talks about how things go right, but in the startup world, actually 99% of the time things go wrong, and therefore how do you cope with that? That's the critical piece, and that's where having resilience as a part of your DNA is very important. And the third one is scrappiness. And I know many people discuss low cost base. I would actually turn it into scrappiness because it doesn't matter what your cost base is. What's as important is how much you can actually derive from the resources that you have. So let's say if it takes you $1 million to get to a certain point, what would it get you to get to 10 times that point? And therefore, there are scale and loss, which basically suggests that if you can be more efficient with your capital, with your talent, with any other resource that might be available, time being one of them, and you can achieve greater in a shorter amount of time, that means that you're on a path to potentially being more successful than others. I think obviously that's on the opportunity side. I think the biggest challenge that I see here is just a sheer number of cases that would be lighthouse examples for what success looks like. And I think related to that is risk appetite, because startup, as Olga mentioned, is a very risky endeavor, right? 97% of startups fail. And therefore, someone who goes on this endeavor or goes to do this endeavor needs to be comfortable with risk. And I think what I have noticed, and this is just a pure observation, there is no hard numbers behind it, is there is a balance between shorter term gains and longer term potential. So in countries where historically there has been political and economical instability, if you look at the last 50 years, you would see that people might take shorter term opportunities instead of longer term bigger potential. So what it means in reality is that if you look at, for instance, the IT industry, many of the companies that have succeeded in Moldova are more on the services side rather than the product side. And therefore, in my view, unless you change that perception and unless you have a couple of great examples that show people what can be achieved, it's going to be very hard to then solve that problem. We have UiPath across the border in Romania that has been for quite some time being a lighthouse. We now have 11 labs out of Poland that also has become a lighthouse, what can be achieved, but we need many more. If you look at all of the other countries, there are dozens, if not hundreds. That's why in the US, Silicon Valley has become the center of gravity, because you have the talent density, you have the capital density, but also you have inspiring cases what a lucrative job versus a startup job could look like.
Thank you, Sasha. Look, you work for a top fund, right? So let's double click on some of the things you said. You work for a top fund, and I'm sure there's many startups here who would crave an investment from Atomico, right? So you back some of the most successful companies in Europe, and correct me if I get anything wrong, but I think you invested in Klarna, you invested in Supercell, Clash of Clans, you've invested in Pipedrive, you've even invested in MessageBird. I didn't know, it's a good friend of mine of 20 years, Robert Fiss. So all these people, what does it take to get an investment from Atomico? And before you answer, I actually would like to see a show of hands. Who are startups here who would love to raise money from a fund like Atomico? Please raise your hand. Okay, guys, I hope I see more hands here. Okay, we have at least, like a dozen people looking to raise from you. What it takes? What does it take?
Yeah, I mean, funny you mentioned Robert and MessageBird, because I think he is epiphany of what we're looking for. And eventually, I think there is no silver bullet to say, well, these are the 5 things. If you hit them, you get an investment, not necessarily from Atomica, but from any fund. I think every fund is different, and there is no also a right way to do investments. I think for us specifically, the most critical, if I were to give you one thing to really focus on, the most critical piece is execution. And being a ruthless executor, crashing through the walls, achieving the goals is the most critical predictor of success. And the reason why I mentioned this is Robert is a great example of that. And that company has been bootstrapped for quite a while before they took the first investment. And I think execution gets down to how ambitious you are and what are you attacking, like what is the end goal you're going after, and how much you can actually bridge where you want to be with where you are today. How can you distill that path into a number of steps that you want to go through, but then most importantly is then achieving and taking those steps. And I mentioned 95 to 97% of companies fail. Most of them fail because of execution, because many people might have great ideas, even more people might have great ambition and markets that they attack and great products, but eventually if you don't have execution, it will be almost a moot point.
Robert, as we're talking about him, he's a little bit crazy. Do you have to be a little bit crazy to be a successful founder?
I think, as I mentioned before, you in order to be a founder in general, you need to be a little bit crazy, because it's irrational decision to forego a lucrative job, stability, and everything that goes with it, and get yourself into a story that is not predictable. One day you wake up, it's all up and to the right. The other day you think that you're failing. So I think there is still a bit of irrationality in that decision itself. So you need to be either comfortable with that irrationality, or you need to be rational yourself.
Okay, thank you. So look, Olga mentioned we have a small market, right? So in a way, our startups are destined to be regional, at least regional, but actually ideally global champions. So you've backed some of the successful rollout stories, that started, say, Klarna started in Sweden, but then expanded to continental Europe, now kind of taking over US. So any practical advice to make that leap from local to regional to global?
Yeah, I think in the end, every story is different and unique. And I think there is no playbook how to start something locally and expand, because the product might be different, the market might be different, the macro environment, as we know right now, is different, and so on and so forth. I think one critical piece that we have found being a predictor of success when it comes to international scaling, I wouldn't say local versus global, but more like international scaling, is the founding team or one of the founders moving to the respective markets. Because I think it's very, very hard to actually expand from any country to any other country. Even though there might be similarities in terms of the culture, there might be similarities in terms of the market structure and so on, there are many things that one would not take into account when they just sit in their comfortable office in one country and they think about scaling to another country. So one of the biggest elements that we have seen is one of the founders, whoever that is, it might be the technical person, might be the business person, usually it's the business person, moves to the respective market. And then they explore from the within what it means to scale their product to the market. They then recruit the people, they need to be on the ground, they need to show leadership, they need to show that they are there, they need to control, especially for the first stages, how it's going, what's not going right, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I think without having someone on the ground, and usually the reason why I say it's a founder, because they have ultimate responsibility and ultimate accountability for the results. It's very hard to make sure that everything, get back to my point, everything is executed without a flaw. So from that perspective, especially when it comes to, for instance, Europe to the US, scaling to the US without someone on the ground is almost impossible. Scaling from a smaller market to a larger market is almost impossible, because the set of assumptions that you will have sitting in a small market will be almost invalid for the bigger market. The dynamics might be different, and so on and so forth. So the practical advice here: pack your stuff, move to the country that you want to expand to, spend 3 months there, just feel whether you think that there is an opportunity there, move back, prepare everything, and then move to the respective country again. Maybe it might be a permanent move, maybe it might be a short move, but I do think that that makes a critical difference for the startup journey.
Thank you, Sasha. And as we stay on this kind of practical advice theme, so again, thinking of the startup founders or prospective startup founders in this audience, so what is like one powerful, but I challenge you, practical piece of advice you would give them?
That's a very high bar. Maybe the biggest thing that I think would make an impact is really being focused in your aspirations and your endeavors and your startups on solving a problem with a product. Because getting back to my initial point, I do think that there are many things you can solve with services. There are many things you can throw, human labor into, and therefore, for some time, it might be a profitable business, but it's not scalable. And I think the most successful companies we have seen, they understand the scaling laws. They understand that if they created a product that solves a problem for one customer, and then that product can solve the problem for 1,000 more customers without additional effort, whatever that effort means, that is a prerequisite for success. If you don't have that, if your model is not suited for scaling, and most of the services models are not suited for fast scaling. Getting back to Olga's point, fast growth is a prerequisite for, I wouldn't call it being called a startup, but being potentially a risky, high risk, high reward venture. So I think from that perspective, really trying to focus, how can I solve this problem with something that is scalable? And I think that takes imagination, it takes technical skills, but it also takes courage, right? Because you can say, well, I can do it myself in 3 hours, or I can spend 3 months developing a product that will do it in 3 minutes. But the risk reward is very different. One, you'll get cash today. You'll be happy with a small amount of cash, but sooner. The other, you need to invest. You need to take a leap of faith that that product would be scalable, that it would work. And therefore, it's a very different risk appetite that one needs to have. And I do think that, getting back to my earlier point, if we all can change that one thing in the mentality of Moldovan startups, that would make a massive difference, just because that's where you would attract capital, that's where you would attract people that have the right risk tolerance, and that's how then you create those lighthouse examples of companies that not only make a profit today, but become a billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, $1 trillion companies, and they create more jobs. They create, kind of will effect of recycling of capital and talent.
Thank you. And by the way, maybe a note here and a piece of advice to the startups here. So take advantage of the investors being here. Take advantage of Sasha being here. Harass this guy. Just come to him. Sorry, I put you on the spot here. So harass him. Come after him. Ask him the phone number. Ask him his email. He may refuse to give it, but chase him. Right? And start building the movie for a fund like his. He's not going to invest overnight if you pitch him tonight. That's the best advice I got. Sorry, I'm getting in your shoes here, but the best advice I got, investors invest in movies, not in pictures when you raise, right? So start building the movie for him. Today is a picture, say 1 month from now when you send your startup update, it's going to be another picture, and he's building the movie. So chase these people here. Please don't let them go easily to lunch. Okay, so look, I want to bring it all to life, all the advice you gave. Let's maybe speak of investment you did, maybe you led as a partner or investment director, previous role, whatever the role. Look, let's bring it to life. So maybe you can give us an example of a company you as a founder invested, maybe you led it, and what was the company? What got you excited? How you thought about it? Why you backed it? By the way, that's not in our scenario. I'm putting him on the spot a little bit, but we have a little bit more time left.
Yeah, I can talk about this for hours, so I think we have only 6 minutes, so I'll try to condense that. And I think it will be a good example of many things that we discussed right now. One of the companies that I partnered up with is a company called Lakera. They're a initially Zurich-based company that does Gen AI cybersecurity. So how many people know about Gen AI here? All right, great. So Gen AI is a form of AI that has become very popular with ChatGPT. Many people might have heard about ChatGPT. One of the challenges with those models is that when you start using them as a consumer or as an enterprise, it opens up a can of worms when it comes to cybersecurity, because you don't know what's happening inside of the model. You don't know what is getting inside of the model and what's getting out. And there are horror stories where you might get instructions for doing malicious things. I will not talk about what those things are, but you can get instructions if you ask the ChatGPT to give you those instructions. Or, for instance, if an enterprise used a ChatGPT-like solution, you can get the data that you shouldn't have access to. So let's say we work at the same fund. I will ask ChatGPT, oh, what's Vasile's salary? Might be a cool thing to chat about, but
I don't want to intimidate you.
No, but and I shouldn't have access to that information, but because the models are structured in a certain way, I can get access through ChatGPT, not directly in the database, not directly in the HR system, but through ChatGPT. So what Lakera does, they put a guardrail in between the user, whoever the user is, and the LLM, the ChatGPTs of the world and others. And then it does two things. It prevents the data getting in the data that should be there. It's called data poisoning, where you kind of try to trick the model to think that a world looks like one thing instead of the other. And it prevents the data leaking out, which means that I, as a user that doesn't or shouldn't have access to information, wouldn't have access to that. They started in Zurich. The founder just moved to the US literally a week ago. I visited them in San Francisco. And the team is now split between two markets. One is in Europe with a base in Zurich, and the other one in San Francisco. And one of the important pieces that led us to invest, or actually two, was one is, if you think about the future of Gen AI, and we believe that Gen AI will be everywhere, if you think about the future of Gen AI, it's not hard to imagine that a security solution for a Gen AI application will be needed. Whatever the dominant LLM is, ChatGPT, DeepSeek, any others, there will be a need for a solution like that. And therefore, we believe that there is a market creation potential, which usually leads to much greater outcomes, because market right now is non-existent. Obviously, it's tiny. People like to discuss large markets, but it's not always what gets our attention. Sometimes tiny markets that can grow faster would be much better. So the market is non-existent. There is an opportunity to be the leader in that market. And the second, getting back to ruthless execution, they have been able to grow from very small revenue to millions of revenue in less than a year. And that for us is a good signal that they are not only onto something big when it comes to the market, the product, the customer pool, but they also are able to execute on the opportunity. Because even now, many people might think, oh, GenAI and cybersecurity sounds kind of makes sense. And therefore, from the idea perspective, it's not novel. It's not hard to imagine that there are a bunch of other companies that are doing this. But execution is what bridges a company that potentially could make it versus a company that would just be delusional about their capabilities to execute on the plan.
Very interesting. Okay, so we are going to be on time. Actually, maybe the first people to be on time in this event. So Olga, out of respect for the program, because I understand we're a little bit behind, right? So we're going to do a rapid fire. That's my favorite part. So we have 2 minutes to cover, how many, about almost 10 questions.
5 seconds, yes.
So very short answers, and I'm going to force you into some funny choices. Okay, so rapid fire. First, on a scale from 1 to 10, where are we in terms of fundraising environment for startups?
10 for AI, 3 for non-AI.
Jesus. Okay, that's challenging. Build AI, guys. Second, VC or bootstrapping?
Well, it's self-serving for me to say VC, but I would say bootstrapping.
Good answer. Third, all investors are talking about people, product, and market. Right? So, but in which order, according to you? People,
I would say
product, market.
People, and then far, far behind will be product, and even far further behind will be market.
Interesting. Thank you. Successful founders, visionaries or relentless troubleshooters?
If we're talking about a small-ish outcome, only execution matters. If we're talking about big outcomes, it has to be execution first, vision second, but there has to be both.
Thank you. MBA for founders, very bad idea or okay idea?
I mean, it's very hard for me to answer after Olga's speech. I would say, all right, let me be polite here. I'll say helpful, but not vital.
Thank you. US versus Europe. Do we have the ambassador still? US versus Europe.
Come on, Europe.
Nice one. OpenAI versus DeepSeek.
Hard to choose between two of those, but I would say open source versus closed source. So I would always choose open source, which is DeepSeek is one of the open source models. I'm not sure whether I would bet on DeepSeek because of the background of the product, but open source for sure.
5 seconds left, the most important question. Mamaliga or Zama?
Mamaliga first and then Zama.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Sasha. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here.